My name's Kent, and I'm currently the director of engineering over at Yelp. I spent about a decade in building developer productivity tools, and more recently, I've moved over to the consumer product. So I've actually had to consume all the tools that I've been building for the last 10 years. Yeah, I mean, I think most people think of DevOps specifically when they think about developer productivity. We ended up partnering with infrastructure rather than being an infrastructure group. So a lot of our development was application infrastructure. So that could have been something that blurs the line between the two, like build. Like you can think of your Jenkins builds and stuff like that. Sometimes that's over in the infra group. But maybe even more on the application side, we built all of the web frameworks that we use at Yelp. Simple platforms so that people can push code out into production fast and seamlessly. So we got our inspiration for this type of group from Twitter, who had an engineering effectiveness group. We called our group engineering effectiveness as well. I think today most people call it developer productivity, but the idea behind this group is basically that you get to have more bandwidth for your group than you normally would have by centralizing some functions. And so for instance, if you can just put a couple of devs towards taking something that is commonly done on the application infrastructure side and a place where you wouldn't as typically do it, like maybe it's a little bit more common to do that on core infrastructure, like your Kubernetes cluster, like treat that as a platform that you come and use. The next question is like, as everybody's building out all their products, what is common application infrastructure that might need to be built? And if you can centralize that, if you can develop best practices there, then instead of needing, a 500-person engineering group to support that, maybe you could get away with 300 engineers, but you have just some dedicated engineers to focusing on that centralized platform for the group. Well, I think the first thing to think about is, do you actually need a developer productivity team? Because depending on your scale, you may not. So we had about 200 engineers when we created our first developer productivity team. It was only 6 engineers, and we actually pulled from existing engineers to build that team. So if you're a company that's pre-product market fit, you shouldn't even be thinking about a developer productivity team. But if you are hitting scale and you are hitting a place where you're churning that flywheel, then that might be a place where you start considering, and you have to ask yourself, like, are we slowing down because, or are we not scaling effectively, when we're launching out our product? Yeah, so I've done this in 2 spaces. In the developer tools space, which also would be equivalent to SaaS adopting AI for the product. And then I've also done this from the consumer product perspective. In both places, what I've noticed is that you get what seems like an amazing outcome very quickly for the space that you're working in. But then when you actually are going to like a production grade version of it, you realize that there's a lot of cracks and to making sure that works the way that you want it to work. And so that last mile takes a really long time to get right if you're going into the AI space. The demo to production instance does take some time. And I think a lot of it is because the tooling around creating these production instances, we have these things called evals, right? To basically evaluate whether or not the LLMs are acting the way that we expect in a variety of different use cases. If you don't have a good framework for iterating with your evals, then you could be looping on things. And so basically you could improve one thing and then regress on something else that you may not realize. And so we found that the key to actually moving forward rather than backwards is just making sure that we have a good test set, a good eval set that we're going to benchmark against as we continue to move forward in the AI space. I think there's different things that we have to think about depending on the space. Like I'm in the consumer space right now. So if I'm thinking about cost, I'm thinking about millions of users hitting that LLM. So maybe I can't use the most expensive model out there. And so as I decrease my spend on the model, I might be decreasing the performance of that model in ways that are unexpected. And so that's why you kind of have to like break down each one of these pieces where you have to have, maybe you test with the best model that's out there, use the evals that you have and make sure that it's passing the test cases that you expect. And then comes the case where you start the optimization phase, which is like, is this actually cost effective for my use case? And then on the developer productivity side, you have kind of an input token cost, especially when you're thinking about throwing entire code bases into your context if you wanted to go that route, which may not be super effective as well.
Have you found that effective? Like,
Yeah, I mean, this is like the challenge with context windows. They keep on getting larger and larger, but the, it's kind of like, I guess I would say garbage in, garbage out, right? So I think people feel like they can just throw everything into the context window and they're going to get some good result. But really, the best solution is to pick the right information to give the LLM. So some sort of RAG where, it's a search that has to happen beforehand to provide to the LLM so that it can make smart choices on top of that. On the consumer side, you can imagine if you had like a chatbot or something like that. Even if you imagine like a customer service agent that had to act in a specific way, right? You probably have some guidelines on how it should react to customer responses, and you probably want some level of accuracy associated with that. And then you have some level of scale that you're sending that, like the number of people that are using it. On the developers tool side, you might have code generation, which is kind of an interesting thing. And I think a lot of people think of code generation in terms of IDEs nowadays, but when we're thinking about it from a developer productivity standpoint, we typically think about it in terms of large-scale migrations. So you can imagine, like, say we want to move to TypeScript. We had to move from Flow to TypeScript. And we saw that that was going to take, and this is like a ton of these migrations take a ton of time. So it's like, we added up 4 years of developer time that it was going to take to go from Flow to TypeScript. It's not that this is sequential, but just if you add up all the time for all the teams, it's going to take that amount of time. So then you start asking the question of, can I speed up this process? Are there things that we can do to automate it? And we start from the non-AI solutions, which are like can we have some code mods? So we start to notice patterns across the code bases on these migrations that we could apply and see if they stick in, from code base to code base and migration to migration. But guess what? AI is a really good pattern detector. So can you start to have some of that fuzziness come in and facilitate some of the code migrations as well? And so that is a really interesting one where you need a different type of checking loop. And in our case, we use like a TypeScript type checker to make sure that the code that was being output was actually correct. And then we'd have to have somebody come in and validate. And so we have different types of loops that happen there as well. I think the way that we think about that internally is the more experienced people that we have this tribal knowledge. And the way that we try to get that tribal knowledge out of those people is through documentation. But we know that documentation is a pretty heavy lift for most people. And so the question I think we're asking is like, well, how do we reduce that lift and just kind of go into an auto-documented world? And we realize that like Slack, for better or worse, ends up becoming kind of a living form of documentation. And we also notice that there's a lot of people that ask a lot of the same questions in Slack over and over again. And so that was a prime space for us to just start taking all of the Slack messages that we had and ingest them into a data store, and then use that for retrieval, and actually use that for on-point bots. So just like you might think about this for on-call, and maybe decreasing the burden by helping maybe that SRE that comes on to that on-call instance by giving them information of what's going on, what's happened in the past, and some of that tribal knowledge. You can kind of do the same thing for on-point. If you think about on-point, like if somebody's new to the team, they might need a little bit of time to get used to on-point, right? Like there's usually that first week where they're getting used to the systems and stuff like that. That's a great thing about using AI in this space, is that we can use those pattern matching capabilities to start to suggest what might be wrong and actually help cure some of that on-call burden for those infrastructure teams. I think it's the right information at the right time. So instead of a proliferation of information, it's getting down to a concise answer, or in some cases, like AI isn't quite there. So if it gives the wrong answer, we need an opportunity to be able to explore beyond that point. So I think there is a piece of this where we can say the ideal is that AI gets to give us the right answer. It keeps us from having to spend a ton of time to problem solve, right? In the meantime, until we get to that ideal, we probably need some sort of form for the engineer or the SRE to be able to explore alongside with AI to understand what's going on and use it as more of a co-pilot, rather than as looking at some AI as like the place where you're going to get your question answered. We're going to be talking a lot about agents today. I've been using Codex a little bit just to play around to see how capable it is. And, for the simple tasks, it's fantastic because I can just send off a simple task to it, does what it needs to do. Even if it gets it wrong, it might be able to get it in the next shot or the shot after that. And it doesn't take too much of my time. But there were some tasks where they were a little bit harder, where I just kept on looping and it just kept on coming back with the wrong answer. And I think some of this has to do with maybe planning and getting better in that space. Some of it has to do with context and making sure we are surfacing the right context at the right time. And some of it might have to do with just general model capability. So I think as we see improvements in all of these areas, then we'll start to be able to rely on agents or AI to do a little bit more on our behalf. But I think the toughest place, a lot of times you see examples in greenfield projects, but I think the toughest space is the brownfield space, where you have so much information, especially when you have multiple millions of lines of code. People do things in ad hoc ways, the unexpected ways. There's unobservable things that are happening in your code, unless you've loaded the whole code base, and then you still have to know where to look in that code base. And still, 2 million lines of code is probably not the smartest thing to load into your context window. So I think that's kind of where I'm talking about from a consumer in a mid to large size company. I'm still a little bit skeptical on capability, and I don't know if that's necessarily the model capability. It might just be the context and how we're planning with these models. This is like a really interesting space because I feel like there's this existential question right now in AI, like how far do we lean into AI for some of these tools? And so, one way we can say is just like completely lean in, the agent does everything for us and, we don't have any jobs anymore. Um, the other side is like, hey, this is a co-pilot. This is something that will help us do our jobs better, more efficiently, and maybe have more fun doing it because maybe we can just offload all the things that we don't enjoy doing. And so I'm really excited and interested to see like how that's changing over time and how the industry's, thinking about that shift. So I moved over from the infrastructure space to the consumer space. And I think there's this pretty common story of not everybody gets up for on-call. It escalates a few times. I think I'm the fourth escalation level now. And so I got put on call and I'm like, wait a second, there's so many lines below. Why did I have to, come on call for this? And, I jumped in, probably some people were still sleeping. It's okay. It happens every once in a while. That's why we have escalation policies, right? But then, the second piece that comes in is like, oh, okay, now I have to get a lot of context really quickly. Because this is not something where I'm in the weeds on every day. And so, I'm spending my time going through Slack, trying to spin up on what's going on for the incident. I'm a little bit of the communicator on this. I'm a little bit of like approving some of the messages that are going around throughout the company on this. And it's just, it always ends up being a stressful experience. I feel like if you're an infra, maybe if you're SRE, I mean, I've asked some SREs this in our org before, and they're like, I love this. It's like, this is what I get up in the morning to do. But over on the consumer side, I don't think I know any engineers that would like say, oh, I love this. I love waking up, early in the morning to fight fires. And so, yeah, I think like this feeling of like getting that buzz at, 4 in the morning or whatever time it is, realizing that it missed a couple of checks and then having to build up all that context and make sure you're communicating properly across the organization. It's a tough and stressful thing and probably want to do less of that going forward.